The morning Isolde Vane was publicly destroyed began with white roses. She had cut them herself at dawn, 30 perfect blooms from the garden of Thornfield Manor, each stem trimmed at an angle the way her mother had taught her. She had arranged them in a crystal vase and carried them up the stone steps to the front parlor with her heart beating fast. Not from fear, not yet, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. She was 22 years old. She had dark eyes, ink-stained fingers, and a quiet way of standing in doorways as though she was always deciding whether she belonged inside or out. She wore her best dress, the pale green one with the ivory buttons down the front, and she had pinned her hair up carefully. She looked like a woman who had decided something important. She was right. Something important had been decided, just not by her. The Duke of Ashenvale was 31, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed, and standing in the center of the parlor as though he had been placed there by someone who wanted the room to feel smaller. His name was Reginald Ashford Calloway, and he had a face that belonged on coins, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, the kind of handsomeness that came with a complete indifference to what you thought of it. Around him stood his mother, Lady Dorothea Calloway, dressed in deep burgundy with pearls at her throat. His sister, Mistress Cecily Calloway, who never missed a social collapse if she could help it, and Isolde's own father, Mr. Edmund Vane, a soft man with frightened eyes, who was already looking at the floor. Isolde stepped into the room. She saw the faces. She set the roses down on the side table. Her hands were perfectly steady. Inside, something cracked clean in two. "Miss Vane." The Duke's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It filled the parlor the way cold filled a room in winter. Not by force, but by the simple removal of warmth. "I must be direct with you. I have considered the matter of our proposed engagement at length, and I find I cannot in good conscience proceed." Isolde did not move. She was good at not moving when everything in her wanted to run. "I see," she said. Her voice came out evenly. She had not known she could do that. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" He looked at her then. Really looked. The way you might look at a broken piece of furniture you were deciding whether to repair or discard. "You are clever enough," he said, "but cleverness in a wife is a liability, not an asset. You have no notable fortune, no exceptional connections, and your habits, your reading, your note-taking, your tendency to speak before you are asked, suggest a woman who would make a difficult duchess." A pause. "I require someone manageable." The word hit her like a hand. Lady Dorothea stepped forward with the smooth precision of a woman who had practiced cruelty until it looked like kindness. "We do hope you understand, dear. It is nothing personal. Reginald must think of the dukedom." Cecily said nothing, but the corners of her mouth moved in a way that was worse than laughter. Isolde's father cleared his throat. He said, "Isolde, perhaps you should—" "No," Isolde said. It was the first word she had spoken with any weight behind it. She turned from her father. She looked directly at the Duke. She had picked 30 roses this morning and carried them up stone steps and pinned her hair and worn her best dress. And this man, this cold, polished, incurious man, had just told her she was unmanageable. In that moment, standing in a sunlit parlor with white roses on the side table and her heart in pieces on the floor, something extraordinary happened. She stopped being afraid of him, completely, all at once, like a fever breaking. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace," Isolde said. Her voice was quiet, but it was the quiet of still water over a deep current. "You require someone manageable. I wish you great luck in finding her." She picked up the vase of roses from the side table, turned, and walked back through the parlor door. She did not slam it. That was what struck everyone in the room most, that she did not slam it. She pulled it shut behind her with the precise and measured click of a woman who had decided she was done. In the corridor, out of sight, she leaned against the wall and pressed her free hand flat against the cool stone and breathed. The roses were still in her arm. Their scent was thick and sweet, and she suddenly could not bear it. Outside, in the garden where the morning was still golden and the dew was still on the grass, Isolde Vane set the vase down on the garden wall and sat beside it and looked out across the green hills, rolling away south toward Whitmore Village. Somewhere in the house behind her, her future had just ended. What she did not know, what no one knew, was that something else had just begun. What she also did not know, sitting there on that garden wall in her pale green dress, was that the Duke's younger brother had been watching from the library window the entire time. His name was Emmerich Calloway, and he was 28, and he had heard everything through the parlor window, which faced the east garden. He had not meant to listen. He had been sitting with a book and a cup of tea when the voices started, and by the time he understood what was happening, it was too late to leave without making noise. So he had sat very still and listened to his brother dismantle a woman in 48 words, and then he had watched her come out into the garden and sit on the wall with her roses, and something moved in his chest, sharp and unignorable. He did not go out to her. It was too soon. Everything was too soon. But he put down his book, and his tea went cold, and he kept watching until she finally stood, squared her shoulders against the sky, and walked away down the garden path alone. That evening, Emmerich found his brother in the study. Reginald was reading correspondence. He did not look up. "She took it well," he said by way of greeting. "Better than expected." Emmerich stood in the doorway. He was taller than his brother by an inch and less impressive looking in the way that sometimes made people underestimate him. "She took it well," he repeated, "because she has more dignity than anyone in that room deserved." Reginald looked up then. His eyes were flat and mild. "Don't be sentimental, Emmerich." "I'm not being sentimental. I'm being accurate." A silence stretched between the brothers, thin as glass and just as sharp. "Stay away from her," Reginald said. Not as a suggestion, as a fact, placed on the table like a coin. Emmerich said nothing. He turned and went back into the corridor, and behind him, Reginald went back to his correspondence, and neither of them said another word about Isolde Vane that night. But the coin was on the table, and some coins, once placed, cannot be ignored. To understand what happened to Isolde Vane at Thornfield Manor, you must first understand who she was before it. She had grown up in a tall, thin house on the edge of Whitmore Village, the daughter of a country solicitor who loved books more than money, and a mother who had died when Isolde was 9, quietly and without drama, in the way that some losses arrive, not as a crash, but as a door swinging slowly shut. Her mother's name had been Miriam, and she had been a woman of particular and practical intelligence, the kind that built things and fixed things and solved things without ever needing to announce it. She had taught Isolde to read at 4. She had taught her to think at 6. She had said once, when Isolde was 8, and asking why women didn't go to university, "Because the world is afraid of what we'd do if we knew everything it knows." Then she had handed her a book on natural philosophy and gone back to mending the curtains. After Miriam died, Edmund Vane did his best. His best was warm, but insufficient. He was a gentle man who believed in fairness and forgot about it regularly. He let Isolde read whatever she wanted from his shelves: law, history, Latin grammar, estate management, economics, and he told her she was remarkable, and he meant it completely, and he let her down absolutely when it counted. He had been the one to arrange the meeting with the Calloways. He had dressed it up in words like opportunity and consideration and suitable prospects, and what he had meant was, "We are running short on money, and the Calloway estate has more than enough, and if Isolde could just be a little less intense, a little more agreeable, a little more the kind of woman that dukes selected the way they selected horses, for temperament and lines and quiet." She had understood this. She had tried, in the weeks leading up to the meeting, to be less. She had tried to read fewer books visibly. She had tried to stop asking questions out loud. She had been, for those weeks, a smaller version of herself. It had not worked. It never works. The day after the parlor humiliation, Isolde walked the 4 miles from Whitmore to the market town of Caversham and called on her mother's oldest friend, Mrs. Perpetua Holt, who lived in a tall stone house above the river and had opinions about everything and apologies about nothing. Perpetua was 63, widowed twice, and had the bearing of a woman who had stopped asking for permission somewhere around her 30th year and had never looked back. She opened the door before Isolde could knock and said, "I heard," and drew her inside and sat her at the kitchen table and put a cup of strong tea in her hands without asking. Isolde told her everything. Perpetua listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Isolde finished, Perpetua was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Reginald Calloway is a small man wearing a large title. This is the most common kind of man in England." Isolde almost smiled. Almost. "What do I do now?" Isolde asked. It was the first time in her life she had said those words. She had always known what came next. There had always been a plan, a book, a problem to solve. Now the plan had collapsed, and she was sitting in Perpetua's kitchen, with tea going cold, and her father's financial situation pressing against the back of her mind like a stone. Perpetua looked at her steadily. "You have two choices," she said. "You can mourn this, which is reasonable and appropriate and will take some time. Or you can remember that Reginald Calloway is not England. He is one man in one parlor in one morning, and you have 50 years of mornings ahead of you." She leaned across the table. "What do you know how to do?" Isolde thought for a moment. "I can manage accounts. I can read contracts. I know estate law. I speak French and read Latin. And I can write a letter that would make a stone cry." Perpetua smiled then, wide and real. "Then you are not ruined," she said. "You are unemployed, which is a very different thing." What Perpetua proposed was this. Her nephew, Lord Halston Byrne of Whitecroft Estate, needed a new estate secretary. His previous one had left under circumstances Perpetua described as a confluence of arithmetic errors and personal cowardice. The position paid a small but respectable wage, came with a room in the East Wing, and involved precisely the kind of work Isolde had taught herself to do from her father's shelves over 15 years. It was not what she had been raised to expect. It was not a parlor and a duke and a name that opened doors, but it was real, and it was hers. She walked home the 4 miles back to Whitmore in the afternoon light and told her father that evening at supper. Edmund Vane looked at his plate. "It isn't what I know what it isn't," Isolde said quietly. "I'm telling you what it is." He did not argue. There was something in her voice that had changed. He had heard it, but could not name it. What it was simply this. She had stopped waiting for someone else to decide her worth. She arrived at Whitecroft Estate on a Thursday in late September. The estate was large, 300 acres of hill and woodland north of Caversham, with a stone house at its center that had been built by a man with more money than taste, and subsequently improved by several generations of women with both. Lord Halston Byrne was 55, nearsighted, perpetually behind on his correspondence, and so relieved to have competent help that he greeted Isolde at the door himself and apologized for the state of the desk before she had even sat down. She looked at the desk. It was buried under 6 months of receipts, unread contracts, unanswered letters, and what appeared to be the remains of at least 2 different breakfast plates. She sat down. She rolled up her sleeves. She started. By the end of the first week, 3 tenants had received long overdue repairs, 2 creditors had received structured repayment plans, and Lord Byrne had cried once, briefly, in the corridor, from relief. It was at Whitecroft that she first heard Emmerich Calloway's name again. Lord Byrne mentioned it in passing, something about a shared boundary dispute and a very reasonable conversation he'd had with Reginald's brother at the county agricultural meeting. "Unlike Reginald," Lord Byrne said, squinting at a lease renewal Isolde had just corrected, "the younger Calloway actually listens when you speak. Remarkable quality in a man of that family." Isolde said nothing. She made a small note in the margin of the next document and kept working. But something in her went very quiet and very still, the way water goes still before a stone breaks its surface. She had not thought about the library window. She had not thought about being watched. She had not allowed herself to. But now, in the organized quiet of Lord Byron's estate office, with the afternoon sun coming in at a low angle and the smell of old paper and ink in autumn, she thought about it once, just once, and then she thought about it again. Emmerich Calloway had spent most of his life being the second thing, second son, second opinion. The person in the room whose ideas were adopted without attribution and whose presence at the dinner table was noted mostly in his absence. He did not resent this, or rather, he had resented it long enough that the resentment had composted into something more useful, a very clear-eyed understanding of who people were when they thought they were not being closely observed. He had watched his brother manage people the way a gamekeeper managed fences, useful as containment, nothing more. He had watched his mother furnish rooms with humans as naturally as she furnished them with chairs. He had learnt, early and thoroughly, to read the temperature of a situation before entering it, to say less than he knew, and to never, under any circumstances, want things visibly. These were the habits of a man who had grown up loved conditionally. They were also, as it happened, the habits of a man who noticed things. He had noticed Isolde Vane 7 months before the parlor morning at a summer assembly in Caversham. She had been standing near the long windows at the far end of the room, holding a glass of lemonade and reading the dedication page of a book she'd produced from her evening bag, which was such a specific and unapologetic thing to do at a summer assembly that he had stopped moving entirely and simply stared for a moment before catching himself. He had asked to be introduced. She had looked up from her book without embarrassment and held out her hand and said, "I know who you are. Do you know who I am?" He had said no, honestly. She had said, "Good, then we're starting even." They had talked for 40 minutes about drainage systems and contract law and whether Virgil was better in Latin or translation, and by the end of it, he had the particular sensation of a man who has been looking at a landscape for years and has only just noticed what is actually in it. He had not pursued it. That was the honest account, and Emmerich was committed to honesty with himself, even when it was unflattering. He had not pursued it because Reginald had made his interest in Miss Vane known in the family, and in the Calloway family, Reginald's interests were tended to first. It was not written anywhere. It did not need to be. It was simply the weather of the household, the angle at which the sun came in, the direction everything leaned. Emmerich had stepped back. He had told himself it was because the match made sense for Reginald and the estate. He had told himself this with enough force that he had almost believed it. What he had not been able to tell himself in the private, honest dark of his own rooms was that he had simply been afraid of wanting something his brother had decided to claim, afraid of the word that would be applied to him if he tried, afraid, mostly, of wanting something this much and being wrong about it. After the parlor morning, he did not contact Isolde. He knew she had taken the position at Whitecroft. The county was not large, and news moved through it like wind through grass. He knew she was competent, that Lord Byrne had told several people that his new secretary had the mind of a barrister and the patience of a saint. He knew she was 4 miles away, and that the road between them was open. He did not use it. He told himself this was propriety, a decent interval of time between his brother's rejection and his own appearance. He told himself this was respect. He told himself this 6 times over 3 months, with decreasing conviction each time, until a Tuesday in December, when he rode out to check on a boundary fence near the northern edge of the Whitecroft property, and found Isolde Vane standing in the field, examining the same fence from the other side, breath visible in the cold air, ink on her glove, looking at him across the frost-stiff grass, as though she had been expecting him for some time. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Not Your Grace. He did not hold the title, but not Emmerich either, the formal middle distance. She was wearing a dark coat and a plain hat, and she looked more herself than he had ever seen her, which made no sense unless the parlor meeting had been the last performance, and this was the actual woman underneath. "Miss Vane." He dismounted. They stood on either side of the fence like a metaphor that neither of them acknowledged. "I wanted to say," he began. She held up one ink-stained hand. "You don't need to apologize for your brother." "I know," he said. "I wanted to say that what he said was wrong. Not just unkind, wrong. You are not difficult. You are precise. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. The field was gray and cold, and the fence between them was old stone, and she looked at him the way she had looked at contracts that turned out to be more complicated than they appeared, carefully, without hurry, reading all the way to the end. "That's a very specific thing to say," she said finally. "I've had 3 months to think about it," he said. She did not smile, but something shifted in her face, small, internal, like a window opening somewhere inside a house, where all the windows had been shut. "The boundary dispute," she said, nodding at the fence. "Lord Byrne believes the northeast corner was moved in 1842. Emmerich looked at the fence. He looked back at her. He understood perfectly that the subject had been changed, and that this was not rejection, but provision. She was giving him something useful to do with his hands, while the rest of the conversation settled. "I have the original survey maps at Ashenvale," he said, "from 1838. "Bring them," she said. "I'll have Lord Byrne's 1842 deed." She looked back at the fence. "Thursday?" she said. "Thursday," he said. They did not shake hands. They did not need to. He rode home in the cold afternoon, feeling lighter than he had in months, which was both wonderful and frightening, because lightness of that particular kind was the feeling of caring about something you could still lose. He did not tell Reginald about Thursday. He told himself this was because it was a professional boundary matter and bore no discussion. He told himself this carefully and without complete success. In the study that evening, Reginald was entertaining two county gentlemen over port, and his voice carried into the corridor, easy, authoritative, certain of itself in the absolute way of a man who had never once been told he was wrong by someone whose opinion he valued. Emmerich stood in the corridor for a moment and listened to his brother hold the room. Then he went up to his own study and found the 1838 survey maps and laid them across his desk, and sat with a candle and went over the northeast boundary line with a very fine attention to detail. He told himself he was being thorough. That was also true. Both things can be true. Thorough and quietly, carefully, deliberately hoping. The boundary dispute was resolved in 4 weeks. The original fence, it turned out, had been moved, not in 1842 but in 1851, by a man who had assumed no one would check, in the confident tradition of men who move fences at night. The resolution was entirely professional. The resolution was also, as it happened, conducted over 5 separate meetings, 2 at Whitecroft and 3 at the Callaway estate boundary, in weather that grew progressively colder and did not deter either party in the slightest. Lord Byrne recovered 3 acres and was effusively grateful. He told Isolde she had the instincts of a bloodhound and the manners of a diplomat, which was the highest praise he possessed. He did not notice, or if he noticed, he said nothing, that his estate secretary and the younger Callaway brother seemed to have rather more to discuss at each meeting than the survey maps strictly required. They had begun to talk about everything. That was the only honest description of it. The conversation that had started at the summer assembly and been interrupted by events had simply resumed, as though the 7 months between had been a parenthesis rather than an ending. Isolde told him about Whitecroft, about the collapsed drainage agreement she had renegotiated from scratch, about the tenant family in the North Cottage who needed a new roof and had been afraid to ask for one. Emmerich told her about the Callaway Estate's Eastern holdings, about the parliamentary work he had taken on that Reginald found too tedious to attend to, about a village school near Ashenvale that had no funding and no teacher, and which he had been quietly financing for 2 years without mentioning it to anyone in the house. Isolde looked at him when he said that. "Why quietly?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because in my family," he said, "caring about things makes them targets." She understood that completely. She had grown up around a man who loved her enough to sell her to a duke and called it care. She knew the shape of a house where love was managed like an estate, distributed according to hierarchy, withdrawn according to usefulness. "Your brother," she said one afternoon, and then stopped. They were sitting in Lord Byrne's estate office. She had offered him tea. Outside, the December rain was steady against the windows. Emmerich looked at her. "You can say whatever you're thinking," he said. "In this room, at this table, you can say whatever you're thinking, and I will hear it." She looked at him for a moment. "Your brother reduced me to a list of deficits," she said. "Insufficient fortune, insufficient connections, insufficient tractability. As though I were an investment that hadn't yielded enough return." She paused. "I think about that word, manageable. I think about what kind of man wants a manageable woman." She looked at the rain. "What kind of man does that make him?" "An unhappy one," Emmerich said simply. "Eventually." There was a day in January, cold, gray, the kind of January afternoon that feels like the world has stopped moving, when Emmerich arrived at Whitecroft and found Isolde in the courtyard. She was arguing with a builder who had overcharged Lord Byrne on a stable repair, and she had the invoice in one hand and the original quote in the other, and her voice was entirely calm and entirely immovable, and she was winning, clearly and completely, with the precise application of documented evidence and a tone so steady it made the builder's bluster look like noise. Emmerich stood in the courtyard gateway and watched. She had no idea he was there. She finished the argument, got the overcharge reduced by 40%, shook the builder's hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone closing a meeting, and turned to go back inside, and saw him. She stopped. He was smiling. She looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and pleased. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," he said. She let him carry the invoices inside. It was a small thing. The smallness of it was precisely the point. She did not need him to carry the invoices. She was perfectly capable of carrying invoices. But she handed them to him as she walked past, and he took them without making it a statement. And they walked into the estate office, and she poured the tea, and he spread the invoices across the desk. and they went over them together, and it was so ordinary, so quietly functional and shared, that Isolde had to stop for a moment and register what was happening. She had been proposed to once by a man who had called her a liability. She had been, since the age of 9, quietly and precisely managing her own existence without anyone to help carry the invoices. And here was a man sitting across a desk from her in the gray January light, reading through documentation with a small frown of concentration. And it felt like what Perpetua had always said love actually was, beneath the poetry. Company, real company, where someone was actually present. Then came the letter. It arrived at Whitecroft on the 14th of January, addressed to Lord Byron but flagged for Isolde's attention, from the offices of the Calloway family solicitor. It was formal, precise, and deeply unpleasant. It noted that it had come to the family's attention that a Miss Isolde Vane, currently employed at Whitecroft Estate, had been engaged in repeated and unsuitable social conduct with Mr. Emmerich Calloway, second son of the Calloway family, and that the family wished to make known their strong objection to any continuation of this association. It requested, in the polished language of formal threat, that Lord Byrne ensure such contact be discouraged. It was signed not by the solicitor, but Isolde turned the letter over twice and read it again, by Lady Dorothea Calloway, the Duke's mother, the woman with the burgundy dress and the pearl throat. Isolde set the letter on the desk. She pressed her hands flat on either side of it. Her face was very still. Her eyes were bright. Lord Byrne, when she showed him the letter, went red in the face in a way that suggested genuine outrage rather than theater. "This is completely improper," he said. "She has no authority over my household. She has no authority over you." "No," Isolde agreed. "She doesn't." She was already thinking, already 3 steps ahead, in the way that she had been 3 steps ahead since she was a child, because no one else was going to be. She thought about the letter. She thought about what it meant. Lady Dorothea Calloway had sent it, not the Duke, not Reginald, who had dismissed her as a manageable deficiency. The Duke's mother, who had pearls and precision and had been in that parlor, which meant that Lady Dorothea had been watching, which meant she was afraid of something, which meant, under all the formal threat and the solicitor's letterhead, that what Emmerich and Isolde had been quietly building in estate offices and cold fields was visible and real and alarming to the right people. That was not discouraging. That was almost, in its way, clarifying. Emmerich received a copy of his mother's letter on the same morning. He knew before he opened it. There was a particular quality to a letter from Dorothea Calloway, something in the weight of the envelope, the precision of the seal, the way it lay on the tray, as though it were already disappointed in you. He read it standing at his writing desk, still in his coat, not yet settled for the morning. And when he finished, he set it down and stood very still for a moment, with his hand flat on the paper, and something in his chest that was quiet and hot and completely resolved. He had spent 28 years in this house managing his reactions, moderating his wants, stepping back, stepping aside, keeping the peace in the way second sons were expected to keep it, by disappearing. He was done. He understood this with the clean certainty of a man who has just watched the last wall between himself and a decision come down. He went to Reginald first. That was the honest thing, and Emmerich was committed to honesty even when it was expensive. He found his brother in the morning room with his newspaper and told him plainly he had been seeing Miss Vane. Not frequently, not improperly, but with sincere intention, and he intended to continue. Reginald's face did not change. His face rarely did. He was very good at wearing it like armor. "She was proposed to by this family," he said, and declined. "She was insulted by this family," Emmerich said, and left with her dignity intact, which is more than she was owed. A silence. Reginald folded the newspaper. "This is not a performance of sentiment, I hope." "It is not. She has no fortune, no useful connections." "I know. She is considered by every relevant party in this county to have been passed over." "I know that too." Reginald looked at his brother. "Then you understand the position this puts the family in." "I understand the position it puts you in," Emmerich said. "That's not the same thing." He rode to Whitecroft that afternoon. Isolde was in the garden, walking the perimeter of a drainage ditch she was redesigning, wearing her dark coat and the plain hat, with a notebook in her hand and mud on her boots. She looked up when she heard him, and she saw his face, something she had become very good at reading, the particular quality of his expression that meant he had made a decision and was coming to tell her about it. She waited. He dismounted and walked over the grass to where she stood and said, without preamble, "My mother sent a letter." "I received a copy," she said. He nodded. "I spoke to Reginald." She waited again. "I told him I intended to continue seeing you." A pause, brief and full. "He did not like it." She looked at him steadily. "I imagine not." He looked at her with the very particular expression of a man who has just done something that costs something. "Does it bother you, what they think?" she asked. He almost smiled. "Does it bother you?" She looked down at the drainage ditch. "They already think the worst of me," she said. "I've run out of worse to fall to." What followed in the next month was not a romance in the conventional sense, not carriages and drawing rooms and careful dance floor proximity. It was shared work, mostly. Emmerich began coming to Whitecroft on Lord Burns' invitation, technically, professionally, with the boundary matter still providing cover for the first few visits. He helped Isolde untangle a particularly complex tenancy inheritance that had 3 competing claims and no clear resolution. She read the parliamentary documents he brought her about the proposed infrastructure legislation he was supporting and made notes so sharp and useful that he began to suspect she understood the legislation better than half the people voting on it. They ate their lunch together in the estate office. They argued about contract law. They laughed, occasionally, at things that required specific shared context to find funny. One evening in February, Emmerich stayed later than he had meant to. Lord Burn had gone to bed early, and the house was quiet, and they were still at the desk with a candle and the remains of supper and a map of the north drainage proposal spread between them. The candle had burned low. The room was warm. Outside, the frost had thickened on the window glass. Isolde said, "If this goes forward, the drainage scheme, it will affect 12 tenant families. I want to be sure each one is consulted individually, not just through the estate." She was leaning over the map with her hair loosened slightly from its pins. She had ink on her chin from a pen she'd been tapping. She didn't know about the ink. Emmerich looked at her for a moment and thought, with perfect clarity, that he had never in his life wanted to be somewhere more than he wanted to be in this room, at this table, with this woman who had ink on her chin and 12 tenant families in her heart. He said, "I'll come with you when you do the consultations." She looked up. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." That was the sentence that changed the shape of things. I want to. Simple, direct, unhedged. Isolde had spent most of her adult life being around people who wanted things at a careful remove, who used the language of duty and practicality and suitability to discuss what they actually wanted and never quite said the real thing aloud. Emmerich had just said the real thing. She looked at him across the map and the candle and the ink-stained February table, and she felt something that she had been guarding against feeling since the garden wall and the white roses and the parlor door closing. She felt seen. Not catalogued, not assessed, not found sufficient or insufficient, seen. All the way through, the drainage ditch and the tenant families and the ink on her chin included. "All right," she said quietly, and the word landed between them like a key turning in a lock. 3 days later, the second letter arrived. This one was not from Lady Dorothea. This one was from the Duke himself. It was addressed to Emmerich, and its message was short and without ambiguity. If Emmerich persisted in his association with Miss Vane, Reginald would revoke his access to the family income, cut his quarterly allowance entirely, and have it put about in every relevant county circle that Emmerich had acted contrary to the family's honor. The final line read, "She is unsuitable. You are making a fool of yourself over a woman who was considered and declined. Let it end." Emmerich read this letter 3 times. Then he folded it with great care, put it in the inside pocket of his coat, and went directly to Lord Burns' estate office. He knocked. Isolde looked up. She saw his face. She said nothing. He sat down across the desk and placed the folded letter between them. She read it. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, not with tears, with something considerably more durable than tears. "You don't have to," Isolde said. It was the 3rd time she had said a version of those words in the weeks since the letters had started. She said them carefully, without self-pity, with the particular clarity of a woman who had been humiliated once and did not intend for her presence in someone's life to become the cause of their ruin. Emmerich looked at her across the letter. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's the entire point." She pressed her hands flat on the desk. Outside the window, the February afternoon was pale and gray, and the bare trees against the sky looked like old writing. "Your brother controls your income," she said. "I know. Your mother controls your reputation in this county." "I know. And you have done nothing in your life that I can see, to suggest you would blow up everything you have for a woman your family considers unsuitable." She stopped. A breath. "So why would you do it now?" He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letter on the table, and then at his hands, and then at her, and he said, "Because I have spent 28 years managing my wants in a house where wanting things made you a target. I have watched Reginald use that principle to arrange every living thing in his orbit to suit his comfort. I have made myself small and invisible and reasonable." He stopped. "And I am extraordinarily tired of it. I am tired of it in a way that has very little to do with you, actually, except that you are the specific place where I finally cannot do it anymore. You are not a woman my family considered and declined. You are the smartest person in any room you enter. You noticed the fence had been moved. You read contracts for a hobby. You walked out of that parlor and didn't slam the door, and that may be the most dignified thing I have ever seen anyone do." He picked up the letter. "Reginald can have the money. I'll earn my own." Isolde looked at him for a long time. She was not soft in this moment. She was not moved to easy tears. She was doing what she always did with things that mattered, reading them carefully, all the way to the end. "If you do this," she said, "they will make it as difficult as possible. Your mother will say things in drawing rooms. Your brother will tell people you were led astray. Everyone who benefits from Reginald's good opinion will take his side." "Yes," said Emmerich. "And your position here is secure for now," she continued. "But Lord Byrne is 55, and his heir is in Edinburgh, and uncertain about the estate. You cannot count on Whitecroft indefinitely." "No." She looked at him. "I am not a soft bet," she said. "I come with trouble already attached." "I know," he said, for the third time. A pause. "I am also extraordinarily tired," she said more quietly, "of thinking about what I cost and what I'm worth on someone else's balance sheet." Her voice dropped lower. "I would like, just once, to be chosen simply because someone wanted to." He reached across the table, not dramatically, not the reaching of a man making a point, just a hand placed near hers. She looked at it. She placed her own hand over it. They sat like that for a moment in the pale February light, two people who had both been the second choice long enough to know what it felt like, and had finally, sitting across a desk covered in drainage maps and unpaid invoices and the remnants of a threatening letter from a duke, found each other at the bottom of the same arithmetic. "I am going to speak to Lord Byron," Emmerich said. "I want to be properly introduced to your father. I want to do this correctly, not secretly, not apologetically, not with one eye on what Reginald thinks. Correctly." Isolde almost smiled. Almost, but not quite yet. "My father will be terrified," she said. "Good," Emmerich said. "He should be. He let a duke insult his daughter in her best dress, and he looked at the floor. He's not a brave man." "No, but he loves you. That should count for something." She considered this. "Sometimes love isn't enough." "No," he agreed. "But it's a start." Edmund Vane, when Emmerich called on him, was indeed terrified. He opened the door of the thin house in Whitmore, saw who was standing on his step, went pale, and dropped his reading glasses. Emmerich picked them up. He was given tea in the sitting room, where Isolde had grown up reading from the shelves, where Miriam Vane had once taught a small girl about universities and knowledge, where the books were still stacked. To the ceiling, and the curtains still needed mending, and everything smelled faintly of paper and candle wax and old certainty. Emmerich spoke plainly. He was not wealthy, not without the family income, but he was not without resource. He had some savings, the parliamentary work, and a small property left to him directly by his grandfather that Reginald had no claim on. He intended to ask Isolde to marry him. He was asking Edmund's blessing, not because he needed permission, but because Isolde loved her father in the complicated, clear-eyed way you love someone who has failed you and kept trying, and that meant Edmund mattered. Edmund was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "She's stronger than I am. She always has been." "I know," Emmerich said. Edmund looked up. His eyes were wet. "Her mother would have liked you," he said. "Not because of who your family is, because you came here yourself." He cleared his throat. "She would have said you have the sense to know that some things you go and do in person." Emmerich accepted this. He sat with Edmund Vane in the paper and wax-smelling sitting room for another half-hour, and they talked about Miriam, who had taught Isolde to think, and about Isolde, who had never needed anyone else's permission, and about the kind of courage that comes not from not being afraid, but from deciding that the thing you want is worth the cost of being afraid. When Emmerich left, Edmund stood at the door and watched him go, and his face held something that had not been there when the morning started. The look of a man who had just, very late, done the right thing. That evening, Emmerich wrote to Reginald, not a plea, not an apology, a statement of fact. He was cutting himself loose from the family income, would make no claim on the estate, and would appreciate the same professional courtesy in return. He asked his brother, as a final thing, to stop using their mother as a weapon, not for Emmerich's sake, but for hers, because Dorothea Calloway was a fierce and intelligent woman whose talents were being deployed against her own son, and that was a waste of a fine mind. He sealed the letter and sent it. Then he sat for a long time in his grandfather's old study with a glass of wine he didn't particularly drink, and thought about what he was stepping away from and what he was stepping toward, and he found, doing the arithmetic honestly in the last of the evening light, that the numbers came out clearly. He was losing money and position and his family's approval. He was keeping himself. He had not known, until this moment, how much that was worth. Reginald Calloway acted swiftly. That was his particular talent, not passion, not insight, but speed. He moved through a decision the way he moved through a room, with the assumption that everything in it would rearrange to accommodate him. Within a week of Emmerich's letter, he had spoken to 3 influential county families, the 2 gentlemen who sat with him on the District Land Commission, and a Lord Aldous Fenwick, who had a particular fondness for gossip and no fondness at all for discretion. The message distributed was not crude. Reginald was never crude. It was simply shaped. Emmerich had made an unsuitable attachment. He had allowed himself to be led by sentiment into abandoning his family. The woman in question was, and here the language became very careful and very lethal, not what she appeared. The phrase was meaningless, precisely chosen, and devastating, because meaningless accusations are the hardest to answer. Isolde heard about it from Perpetua Holt, who arrived at Whitecroft on a Tuesday morning with the particular expression of a woman delivering intelligence she wishes were not true. She laid it out plainly, who had said what, in which drawing rooms, to whose ears. Isolde listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Is Lord Burns' trust affected?" Perpetua looked at her. No, he called it Calloway nonsense and moved on. Good. Isolde. "I've been called worse things in a parlor in front of my father," Isolde said quietly. "Gossip in drawing rooms I don't enter is considerably less interesting to me." Perpetua was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I find remarkable?" "What?" "You are not afraid." Isolde looked at the window, at the winter garden beyond it, the bare trees and the gray sky. "I was afraid for a long time," she said. "I was afraid in that parlor, and I was afraid walking home, and I was afraid for weeks of what I'd lost." She paused. "I think I used it all up. I don't have enough left to be afraid of Reginald Calloway's opinion." What she had not told Perpetua, what she had not told anyone, was that she was afraid of something else. She was afraid of loving Emmerich Calloway and having it be wrong. Not wrong in the way Reginald had been wrong, not the clinical wrongness of a man assessing her like furniture. Wrong in the deeper, quieter, more devastating way. Wrong in the sense that she might have confused gratitude for love or rescue for belonging. She had been rejected publicly and treated as insufficient, and then a man had come and said she was more than sufficient. The smartest person in the room, the woman who walked out without slamming the door. And how did you know? How did you ever know? Whether you wanted him for who he was, or because he had arrived in the exact shape of what you needed. She sat with this for a long time. She took it seriously. She gave it the same careful, documented scrutiny she gave to suspect contracts. And what she found, going through it honestly, was this. She did not simply feel gratitude, she felt known. Those were different things. The difference was everything. Emmerich had moved himself into his grandfather's small property, a modest house called Heron's Rest, northeast of Caversham. Old stone and a leaky roof, and a garden that had been left to itself for 7 years and had opinions about it. He had his parliamentary income, which was real if not abundant. He had his savings. He had walked away from a dukedom's orbit with the measured calm of a man who has thought it through and found the maths satisfactory. When Isolde visited Heron's Rest for the first time, invited by a perfectly correct letter via Lord Byrne in daylight with propriety and tact, she stood in the front garden and looked at the house with its moss-covered stones and its overgrown rose canes and its windows that let in drafts and its general air of a place that needed someone to care about it. She said, "The roof needs attention." "I know," Emmerich said. She looked at the roses. They were old, overgrown, but the structure was good underneath. She thought of the 30 white roses she had carried up stone steps on a morning that felt very long ago. "The roses can be saved," she said. "I know that too," he said. She helped him with the roof. Not personally. She was not a roofer, but she found the builder, negotiated the contract with the same precise efficiency she had applied to the overcharged stable repair, and had it completed at a cost 30% below what the first estimate had suggested. She organized his correspondence. She helped him prepare the brief for the drainage infrastructure legislation and made 6 improvements that his parliamentary contacts told him were exceptional. They worked together in the study at Heron's Rest on cold evenings with tea and candles and maps, and Lord Byrne was invited to call, and Perpetua was invited to tea, and slowly, steadily, without drama or declaration, Isolde Vane's life began to knit itself around this house and this man the way roots knit around stone, not by force, not by plan, but by the simple persistence of something that had decided to grow. Then came the county agricultural dinner. It was the largest social gathering of the year, and attendance was expected from every landowning family in the district. Emmerich went. Isolde was invited by Lord Byrne, who was on the organizing committee. They arrived separately. That was still the careful thing to do, and found themselves, within 20 minutes, separated by the room's social physics into different conversational clusters. Isolde was in a group with Lady Fenwick and 2 other county wives who had clearly been briefed. She watched them take stock of her. She was wearing her best dress, not the pale green one, that one had associations now, but a deep blue that Perpetua had helped her choose, and that made her look, Perpetua had said, like someone who makes the decisions. She stood straight, she smiled where required, she waited. Lady Fenwick said, very pleasantly, "Miss Vane, we were just discussing the recent changes at Heron's Rest. One hears Mr. Calloway has been making improvements." "Yes," said Isolde, "the roof has been repaired and the drainage sorted. The roses in the front garden should come back strongly in spring." A pause, perfectly timed. "I helped with the contracts." Lady Fenwick blinked. "Oh," she said. And that was all. Across the room, Reginald had seen them arrive, first Emmerich, then Isolde, and watched the evening's social weather shift in the small, invisible way that weather shifts before a storm. He was a man who read rooms for a living, and this room was telling him something he did not like. People who should have been cold to Isolde were interested. People who should have dismissed Emmerich were respectful. Lord Byrne was telling the story of the boundary dispute and the 1838 survey maps to a table of attentive listeners and giving Isolde full and public credit. The gossip Reginald had seeded had not grown the way he'd planted it. It had not grown at all. He looked at his brother across the dinner tables in the candlelight, and Emmerich looked back at him with the expression of a man who has, at last, stopped being manageable. And something in Reginald Calloway's chest, cold and certain and entirely accustomed to winning, shifted just slightly, like a lock feeling the turn of a key. He did not bring flowers. That was the first thing Isolde noticed, and it was deliberate, though she didn't know that yet. Emmerich came to Whitecroft on a Monday morning in late March, when the first warmth was just entering the air, and the mud was still heavy on the garden path, and everything smelled of wet earth and possibility. He asked Lord Byrne, formally and with full transparency, for permission to speak with Miss Vane in the estate garden. Lord Byrne, who had known for 2 months what was coming, and had been waiting with the cheerful patience of a man who had stopped pretending not to notice things, said, "Yes, obviously," and went back to his accounts with the barely suppressed satisfaction of someone who has just seen a good story arrive at its correct page. Isolde was in the garden, checking on the drainage survey stakes. She looked up when Emmerich came down the path. She saw his face. Her stomach did something. He stopped on the garden path. She was standing in the mud with her notebook and her plain hat and the stakes, and the morning was pale and new around them. "I didn't bring flowers," he said. She looked at him. "I know what flowers meant the last time someone dressed this up for you," he said. "I don't want this to look like that. I want this to look like what it is." She was very still. "Which is?" He took a breath. "I love you," he said. "Not because you walked out without slamming the door, though that was extraordinary. Not because you are the smartest person in any room, though you are. Because when you read a contract, you tap your pen against your chin. And because you remembered the names of all 12 tenant families before I'd learnt 6 of them. And because you told me the truth in that first field in December, when you could have been cautious." He paused. "I love you the way you love something that is specifically itself, not a shape that fits a space. You." Isolde looked at him for a long time. The morning was all around them, mud and new light and the smell of turning earth. She thought about the parlor and the white roses and the word manageable. She thought about Perpetua's kitchen and the 4-mile walk from Whitmore. She thought about invoice tables and drainage maps and candles burning low and a hand placed near hers without drama. She thought about her mother, who had told her that her voice mattered, and about the 9-year-old girl who had been handed a book on natural philosophy and told to keep asking questions. She felt the full weight of what she had built in the past 6 months. Not what had been handed to her, but what she had built. Her reputation at Whitecroft, her professional skill, her friendship with Perpetua. Her home in this place where people knew her name for what she did, and not for who she'd failed to marry. She had built that. She owned it. And now this man was standing in the mud, asking to be part of it. Not to replace it. To be part of it. "You understand," she said carefully, "that if I say yes, your family will be very angry." "They're already angry," he said. "The family is a fixed condition at this point. And you understand that I'm not going to stop working. I'm not going to become a drawing room duchess who orders the flowers and receives calls." "Lord Burns' accounts would fall apart in a month," he said. "I've seen the before and after." She almost laughed. Almost. "And you understand," she continued, quieter now, "that I am afraid. I was not afraid in that parlor, and I am not afraid of your brother or your mother or the drawing rooms in this county. But this," she gestured between them, at the muddy path and the morning and the entirety of what was being offered. "This I am afraid of, because I know what it costs to want something and lose it." "Yes," he said. "So do I." He looked at her. "I think that's how you know it's real." "Yes," she said. "Just that. Simple and clear and exactly the right size." He did not sweep her up. He did not make a speech. He took her hand, the one not holding the notebook, and held it, and they stood on the garden path in the March mud, with the wet earth smell and the pale light, and it was nothing like a storybook and everything like the truth. Lord Byrne had to be told, and was told, and made an entirely undignified noise that Isolde pretended not to hear. Perpetua had to be told, and when Isolde arrived at the tall stone house above the river, Perpetua opened the door before she could knock, as she always did, looked at Isolde's face and said, "Thank God, I've been waiting 6 months to not say anything about this." Edmund Vane had to be told, and cried, and said his wife would have been proud, and Isolde sat with him for 2 hours in the book-smelling sitting room and let him cry, and meant every word she said in comfort. There was a letter to write to the Calloway family. Emmerich wrote it. He told Isolde what he planned to say, and asked if she wanted to add anything. She thought for a long moment. "Tell your mother," she said finally, "that I understand she was trying to protect her family. Tell her I respect that she acts from love, even when love makes her cruel." She paused. "But also tell her that I will not be managed, and that her son knows this and chose me anyway." Emmerich looked at her. "That's either very generous or very dangerous." "Both," she said. The letter was sent. The response from Lady Dorothea, brief, formal, not warm, but also not threatening, arrived 3 days later. It acknowledged the engagement and said nothing further. Reginald did not write at all. His silence was its own kind of statement, and Isolde read it the way she read all documents, completely, without flinching, and then set it aside with the matter settled. The announcement was made at the next county assembly, which Emmerich managed by the straightforward method of telling Lord Byrne, who told Lord Peaton, who told 3 people, who told everyone else, which is how things have always actually worked in country society, despite all the formal machinery supposedly in place for such announcements. The reaction was mixed in the expected proportions. Surprise from some, satisfaction from those who had never liked the Calloway family's management of their neighborhood, mild scandal from the drawing rooms that had received Reginald's whisper campaign, and from Perpetua Holt, standing near the long windows, exactly where Isolde had once stood, with a book and a glass of lemonade. The expression of a woman who had been right about something important and was allowing herself to know it. Isolde arrived at the assembly in the deep blue dress. She did not bring a book. She did not need one. She had, at last, a room she entirely wanted to be in. The wedding was planned for June. It was to be simple. Lord Byrne's small chapel, Perpetua as witness, Edmund Vane giving Isolde away with the particular terrified pride of a man doing the right thing late, but meaning it completely. The banns had been read twice. The contracts had been reviewed, by Isolde naturally, who had made 4 amendments and had them accepted without discussion. Everything was in its ordered place. And then, on the last Tuesday of April, Reginald Calloway appeared at Heron's Rest without warning, at 10 in the morning, without a letter preceding him, and knocked on the front door with the air of a man who has decided to exercise a right he has not actually been given. Emmerich opened the door. The brothers stood looking at each other across the threshold. Reginald was impeccably dressed. Emmerich was in his working clothes, papers in hand, slightly ink-stained. Neither of them looked away. "I need to speak with you," Reginald said. "You are speaking with me," Emmerich said. "Come in, then." They sat in the small study at Heron's Rest, not the grand rooms Reginald was accustomed to, not the estate parlors with their good furniture and their implication of authority, but Emmerich's own room with his own books and his own maps, and Isolde's handwriting on half the documents on the desk, because she had been here yesterday working. Reginald looked at the handwriting and said nothing about it. He said, "I am here to ask you to reconsider." Emmerich set down the papers. "No." "Hear me first." A pause. "Hear me." Something in Reginald's voice was different, not soft. Reginald was not soft, but stripped of the armor Emmerich had heard over it every day of his life. He heard it because he knew his brother's voice, the way you know the voice of a house you've grown up in. Every room, every residence, every place where the sound went flat. "All right," he said. "I'm listening." What Reginald said took 30 minutes and cost him, clearly, a great deal. He said that the family finances were in more difficulty than had been admitted. Not ruin, but strain, significant and growing. He said that 3 of the Eastern holdings had been mismanaged under an agent he had trusted, and that the losses were larger than he had told their mother. He said, and here his jaw tightened and his eyes went to the window, that he had proposed to Isolde Vane not merely because of dynasty or manageability, but because he had, in his limited and backward way, believed that her intelligence and her competence would be useful to the estate, that he had not known how to want someone for themselves, that he had only ever been taught to want things for their function. He stopped. He looked at the floor. He said, "I knew, watching her walk out of that parlor, that I had made a catastrophic mistake. Not about the match, about how I'd handled it, about what I'd said." He stopped again. "I should have said it differently." "You should have said differently things," Emmerich said quietly. "Those were different things." There was a long silence. Outside the window, the April morning was bright, and the roses in the garden were coming back. Not all of them, but some, the ones with the deep roots. Reginald looked at them. "I know it's too late," he said. "I know she would not. I know the answer. I'm not here to ask for a chance with her." He looked back at Emmerich. "I'm here because she is going to marry my brother, and I need to know. I need to hear from you that she will be all right, that you understand what you have." His voice was precise and stripped, and completely honest in the way it only ever was when there was no audience and no advantage to be gained. "Because I was given something remarkable, and I treated it like inventory, and I do not want to watch you do the same thing." Emmerich looked at his brother for a long time. He thought about 28 years of secondness, of managing, of stepping back, of all the ways Reginald had shaped the world to his own dimensions. He thought about the 14-year-old boy they had both been, before the title, before the armor. "I understand what I have," Emmerich said. "I understood it in December in a frozen field, and I have not stopped understanding it since." A pause. "She negotiated the roof contract. She improved the parliamentary brief. She knows all 12 tenant families' names." He looked at his brother. "She walked out of your parlor and didn't slam the door, Reginald. What you called unmanageable is what I call complete. I will not treat it like inventory." Reginald looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, short, the nod of a man accepting a verdict. He rose. He picked up his gloves. At the door he paused. "The Eastern Holdings," he said, without turning. "3 of the tenancy contracts are written in a way that may not hold up to legal scrutiny. The agent was creative." "Send me the contracts," Emmerich said, without hesitation. "I'll have Isolde look at them." A pause. "She's the best reader of a contract in the county." Reginald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Yes, I know." He left. Emmerich stood in the doorway of Heron's Rest and watched his brother's carriage go down the lane and felt something shift, not resolve, not mend, but shift, the way heavy furniture shifts when you finally move it after years. The floor underneath revealed, dusty and unfamiliar and real. He went inside and sat down at the desk and looked at Isolde's handwriting on the documents and thought, "You have to tell her, all of it." Not because she needed to know about Reginald's finances, though she would find that interesting, professionally, but because she deserved to know everything about the world she was marrying into. No hidden compartments, no managed distances, no information withheld for her protection or his comfort. He picked up a pen. He wrote her a letter, not a formal letter, not a professional letter, but a real one, the kind that starts where you actually are. He told her about Reginald's visit, about the Eastern Holdings, about the conversation, about the thing Reginald had said at the door. He ended. "He knows. He has always known. I think that is what makes it the saddest, and I think you should know it too." Isolde received the letter at Whitecroft that afternoon. She read it at the estate office desk, with the spring light coming in long and pale through the windows. She read it twice, the way she read everything important. Then she sat with it for a while, just sat, with the letter and the light and the particular quiet of a room where a lot of real work had been done and a lot of real change had begun. She thought about Reginald Calloway in a parlor, calling her unmanageable. She thought about what Emmerich had written, "He has always known," and the specific sadness of a man who sees clearly and acts badly anyway, who understands the value of something and still lets the machinery of his character reduce it to inventory. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt something more complicated and more adult than either. She felt sorry for him. Not in the soft way that cancels responsibility. He had done real harm. But in the hard way, the way you feel sorry for someone who built their own cage and then learned too late what they'd locked out. She picked up her pen. She wrote back to Emmerich. "Tell him I'll look at the contracts, not for the family, for the tenants who are living under them." The wedding was on a Saturday in June, when the roses at Heron's Rest had come fully back, and the garden had sorted itself into something opinionated and untidy and alive. Lord Burns' chapel was small and full of light, and smelled of old wood and summer. Perpetua Holt stood in the front pew with the expression of a woman who had earned the right to look satisfied. Edmund Vane, in a good coat he had pressed himself, stood at the door with his daughter and held her hand tightly and said nothing, because everything that needed to be said had been said in the tall house in Whitmore over 2 hours, and a pot of tea and a great many tears. Isolde wore a dress the color of cream with no particular ornament. She had considered the pale green, and then set it aside, not because it held bad memories, but because it had been the dress of a woman trying to be the right shape. This dress was not that. This dress was hers. She walked down the aisle of Lord Burns' chapel on her father's arm and saw Emmerich standing at the altar, looking at her with the expression she had learned over the past 7 months to read perfectly, the expression of a man who is seeing exactly what is there and finding it entirely sufficient and is not performing this feeling, but simply having it. He was slightly ink-stained on his left cuff. She noticed this and thought it was the most Emmerich thing possible and felt her whole chest fill up with something warm and certain and completely real. Edmund placed her hand in Emmerich's. His fingers closed around hers. Behind them, in the pew, Perpetua made a small noise that was either a sob or something she would firmly deny being a sob if asked. Lord Byrne blew his nose with great conviction into a handkerchief. Outside the chapel's high windows, the June morning went on being blue and warm and indifferent to human drama in the excellent way that summer always is. The words were said. The rings were placed. The Reverend, an elderly man named Hobson, who had known Lord Byron for 30 years and had excellent instincts about the emotional temperature of a chapel, kept his ceremony to the real and essential thing, which was these two people choosing each other, in writing, before witnesses, in full knowledge of the cost. When it was done, Emmerich and Isolde Calloway walked out into the June garden, and the light was extraordinary, the specific gold of an English summer morning that carries the whole weight of everything good that season can be. And Isolde put her face up to it, and felt it on her skin, and thought, I am standing in my own life. Not a parlor someone arranged for me, not a role someone assigned me, not a shape someone needed me to be. My own life, chosen, paid for, built from scratch in a year that asked everything and gave back more. The reception was at Whitecroft, in the garden, with a table that Isolde had organized herself, and which was efficient and lovely, and had excellent food, because she had negotiated directly with the caterer, and had been very clear about standards. Lord Byrne made a speech so warm and rambling that Perpetua had to interrupt it after 12 minutes for the sake of the cold food. Perpetua made a speech that was exactly 9 sentences long and contained more truth per sentence than most speeches contain in total. Edmund Vane stood and started a speech and stopped 3 words in and simply raised his glass and sat down again, which was, everyone agreed, exactly right. Emmerich did not make a speech. Instead, he leaned close to Isolde and said very quietly, so only she could hear, "The roses at Heron's Rest are extraordinary this year." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I told you they could be saved." He smiled. "You tell me things," he said, "and they are always true." 3 weeks after the wedding, the contracts from the Calloway Eastern Holdings arrived. Isolde sat at the desk at Heron's Rest, her desk now, in her house now, with her name on the relevant documents, and read through them with the focused intensity of a woman who takes injustice in legal language personally. She found 4 clauses that were structured in a way that would disadvantage the tenants on renewal, 2 that were almost certainly unenforceable, and 1 that she was fairly certain constituted fraud. She made detailed notes. She wrote a full analysis. She sent it not to Reginald, but to his solicitor, with a cover letter that was precise and professional and impossible to ignore. The solicitor, who had not, to be fair, drafted the original clauses, read it, and then sent a letter to Reginald that apparently contained the words "significant liability" and "immediate review required." The tenants of the Eastern Holdings received new contracts within 6 weeks, better ones, because Isolde Calloway had read all the way to the end. Reginald came to Heron's Rest in August. This visit had a letter preceding it, properly written, properly received. He came in the afternoon and was given tea in the garden and was received by Emmerich and Isolde together. No separation, no management, together. And the 3 of them sat in the garden with the late summer roses around them and talked about the Eastern Holdings and the tenancy reforms and what came next for the estate. It was professional. It was not warm, but it was honest. And there was, underneath the honesty, the first tentative architecture of something that might eventually become familial. Not the old kind, not the hierarchy with its managed distances and conditional love, but something that had been broken down to its components and was being, very slowly, with full knowledge of what it was, rebuilt from scratch. Reginald did not apologize directly. He was not yet a man who could do that. But he said at the end of the afternoon to Isolde, "The tenants will benefit from your work." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "they will." They understood each other perfectly. What Emmerich and Isolde built at Heron's Rest in the years that followed was not a fairy tale. It was better than a fairy tale, which is to say it was real. There were disagreements about parliamentary priorities and estate decisions, and at least one memorable argument about a drainage proposal that lasted 3 days and was only resolved when Isolde produced the original survey data, and Emmerich conceded with the good grace of a man who has learnt to lose arguments to the correct person. There were evenings of absolute quiet, and evenings of absolute chaos, and mornings when the roof leaked again, and mornings when the roses were extraordinary. Edmund Vane came to visit regularly, and was better, gradually, than he had been. Braver, more present, more willing to say the real things at the real time. Lady Dorothea Calloway came once, formally, on a Tuesday in autumn, and sat in the garden, and said very little and left, and when she arrived home, wrote a letter to Emmerich that said, in full, "Your wife is formidable. I see now what I tried to prevent. I was wrong. It was the hardest letter she had ever written. It was also the most important." And Isolde Calloway, who had once stood on a garden wall in a pale green dress with 30 white roses in a future that had just collapsed, sat at her desk at Heron's Rest on a December morning, the fire built against the cold, the roses outside sleeping under the first frost, and thought about the woman she had been in that parlor, afraid and steady, and entirely unaware that the worst morning of her life was also the first morning of everything that came after. She thought about Perpetua, who had said, "You are not ruined, you are unemployed." She thought about her mother, who had handed her a book on natural philosophy and told her to keep asking questions. She thought about 12 tenant families, whose names she still knew, and a drainage scheme that had worked, and a bad contract made right, and a man who arrived in the morning with ink on his cuff and said, "I want to with no apology and no condition." She picked up her pen. She had work to do. She always had work to do. That was not the burden. That had never been the burden. That was the whole point and the great gift, and the thing no one had ever been able to take from her. She knew how to build, and she was not finished.